Right. Well, welcome. My name is Jen Olson, and I'm an extension specialist at Oklahoma State University. I serve as the lab director and a plant disease diagnostician in the Plant Disease and Insect Diagnostic Laboratory at Oklahoma State University. Um, Kind of have this general title, Don't Get Caught with Your Plants Down. But specifically today, uh, I am going to talk to you about some common problems in the landscape. So we're going to spend a bit of time on rose rosette disease. This disease has really been making its way across the country. So I want you to be aware of it, how to spot it, and some of the different management strategies for that problem. Then we'll look at leaf spots, anthracnose, some canker diseases, vascular wilts, and then we'll finish up by just talking about how to prevent diseases in the landscape. So rose rosette. I've been involved with research on rose rosette basically since about 2011. I have observed, I'm in Oklahoma, how roses have really changed how we're utilizing roses in our landscapes here. And I suspect if you don't have this problem, that at some point you will. And so making you familiar with it is the first step. Back maybe 1990s, these are some images of a park in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where there's a beautiful rose garden with more than 5,000 roses. And in the early 2000s, rose rosette moved into this planting. And unfortunately, by 2013, most of the roses were infected. And now most of the beds don't have any roses in them. It's become more of a pollinator or seasonal display garden. So rose rosette, if you're not familiar with it, it is a disease that's caused by a virus, the rose rosette virus. Roses are the only known host. And so if you have other plants on a property, you don't have to worry about them. It only affects roses. And it's spread primarily by propagation. So in nurseries, sometimes get it, and then they ship them to new areas. So that's how we get it to new locations. It can be spread by grafting. And locally in communities across the nation, it's primarily spread by when eriophyid mites feed on an infected plant and then feed on a healthy plant, they can transmit that virus. So shortly, we'll talk a little bit about those mites. This is you can see the website at the bottom, but this is the current known distribution for rose rosette disease. This map is generated by kind of boots on the ground. People report sightings at this website, and then it's verified by rose rosette experts as to whether or not to color the county that it has been found there. Usually images are required, and then sometimes actual plant samples are requested to be sent in. So you can see it's making its way across the country. It's probably underrepresented on this map. And so if you don't see your county, you might report it the next time you see it. So those mites. Eriophyid mites, there's at least 4 different eriophyid mites that we find on roses. The one that we're specifically concerned with has the Latin name Phyllocoptes fructiphilus. It's the rose flower and bud mite, and it's the only one so far that we know really transmits this disease. So eriophyid mites are tiny. For those that are familiar with spider mites, they're about 1/4 or 1/5 the size of a spider mite. So you might be able to take a hand lens, or if you have a microscope, spot these mites. I'm going to show you how to do that. This is zoomed in under the microscope of where some shoots join the rose cane. And these mites like to hide. So in this image, the arrow is pointing at where there's some debris where a leaf fell in the past. If you use forceps and kind of pluck that little piece up, underneath is where we're going to look for the eriophyid mites. Getting a little closer, look for The mites are generally cream to salmon colored. They're sort of sausage shaped. And here I've circled several at the base of this shoot. So if you're really good, you might be able to do some field identification of these, looking for the mites on the rose plants. Often we find the mites around the blooms. So here we have a rose bud that, just maybe starting to open a little bit. And especially early morning when it's humid, the mites may be moving around on the plant. And so I'm going to circle one area on this sepal where we see several of these mites. So when I go in and remove that sepal, just grabbing it with some forceps, underneath, we can see those petals. The petals are showing a little bit of browning. It's probably the actual damage from the mites is this browning. So not only can they transmit the virus, they can just cause some foliar, some discoloration on those blooms. So symptoms, we'll kind of start with more mild and then see more severe symptoms. Whenever possible, scout roses, look for these symptoms. I encourage people to look for at least 3 symptoms. And if you're not sure, maybe tie a little flag or a string around a shoot, check it in a couple weeks and see if it still looks abnormal or if it's developed normally. And if you're not sure, we'll talk more about testing shortly. So sometimes people will say rose rosette is associated with unusual colors. In those black circles that are on the left, roses often have normal color that is reddish. So we just don't want to take the red color as a symptom of rose rosette. That's why looking for additional symptoms, that orange circle shows some of the more classic symptoms. So we'll zoom in on that. Often the leaf shape is somewhat ragged. Sometimes the leaves become thinner or more strappy. You'll see that better in a moment. And we get these abnormal blooms. It's pretty typical that the whole plant doesn't show the problem. You may see this witch's broom or rosette, which is where the disease gets its name, just on one part of the plant, and we see those strappy, deformed leaves. The witch's broom name arises because you have many shoots or stems or leaves that are arising from the same point or nearly the same point. With time, we often start to get dieback, and you can really see how it gets that name of a witch's broom in this photo. So over time, those witch's brooms, eventually you're going to start to see that the branches, the canes are dying and turning brown if we're not taking any action. Sometimes our home gardeners don't notice any other symptoms except the blooms aren't as pretty. And so in this photo that's on the left, we see the normal flowers of this particular cultivar called brass band. Once the virus gets in, unfortunately, the blooms don't open normally. They may be discolored, and we see some of the other symptoms there. Sometimes it's not a red color. Sometimes we see a lot more yellowing and mottling of leaves. This symptom called stem thickening is another really good indicator of rose rosette. In this black circle at the bottom of the photo, notice that the cane they're pretty narrow canes, but this red one in the orange circle is much thicker and more succulent. And that's a pretty good indicator of rose rosette. And then often people talk about the thorns. We do get this production of excessive thorns or prickles. And it's sometimes helpful to compare branches or canes on the same plant. If we see those in the background, we don't see that many thorns. These ones that are circled in the foreground show heavy thorn production. So seeing that change on an individual plant is pretty typical of this disease. So I encourage people look for at least 3 symptoms before you take action. And also keep in mind that chemical injury can look similar. We don't usually find excessive thorn production with chemical injury, but some of the other changes to the leaves do look similar. So this photo shows glyphosate damage on a rose, which you might confuse with rose rosette. So whenever you're not sure and just want verification, many diagnostic labs across the country test for rose rosette virus, so contact the one near you. Here in Oklahoma, we receive, I would say, about 20% of our submissions to our diagnostic lab come from out of state. And many times it's being submitted for rose rosette virus testing. Texas A&M also offers this as a service. Our only request, we're happy to test it for you. We can tell you whether or not the virus is present. We don't test for herbicides. Our only request is that if you're shipping across state lines, to double bag the sample. And with roses, because of those thorns, sometimes wrapping in newspaper or dry paper towels before putting it in a plastic bag is helpful, so the thorns don't just poke holes in the bags. Just keep it in the fridge until you're ready to send it in. And I know both Texas A&M and OSU, we test for it almost daily, so you get answers pretty quickly. So management. If it's a nursery, there's really going to be no tolerance, and those plants need to be thrown out right away. And the rest of the plants at the nursery need to be monitored. In the landscape, I can encourage people and recommend that we remove symptomatic plants, but not everybody's going to want to do that. And I will say, as we go through management, there's a lot of trials. There's some specialty crop initiatives for sustainable roses that are in progress. And so these management may change the recommendations as we learn more about this problem. Number one question I get asked, well, I just have this one little shoot. Can I just prune it out? And I do sometimes get anecdotes where people tell me stories about how they've pruned it out, but I like to look at actual data and research. Dr. Mark Wyndham, who's recently retired from the University of Tennessee, did some trials looking as to whether or not pruning was effective. And so the minute they saw a plant with symptoms, they would remove the entire cane all the way down to the crown, move the plants to sort of a quarantine area, and monitor to see if rose rosette redeveloped after pruning. And in his trials, only about 30 to 40% of the time was pruning effective. So I wouldn't recommend it. To me, if I go to the doctor and they give me a treatment that's only 30 to 40% effective, I'm going to ask for something better, which is going to be removing the whole plant. Dr. Wyndham and his predecessors now are also looking at different miticides. I think at this point, what they've found with miticides, they're going to be more appropriate to nurseries because they're finding that they need to make treatments every 2 to 4 weeks. And in the landscape, that may just not be practical. You can see some of the chemicals that they've been testing here on this slide. In the early data I saw from his trials, at 2 and 4 weeks, plants were symptom-free, but I haven't seen any updated results since this initial was released. In Oklahoma, in the landscape, one thing that we did in one of our trials is we went out to that municipal rose garden that I showed you when it still had a lot of roses, and we collected rose samples every week and had an entomology student who counted how many roses he was finding on those plants. And what we found is that usually when we are finding mites and increasing population of eriophyid mites is when the rose plants are flushing out new growth. And so especially for us in the spring, from about late March to late May, and then during the summer, not too many mites. But in the fall, when roses start to send out new growth, early September through October, those populations would go up. And it does seem to correlate with flushes of new growth. You might need to adapt those timings a little bit for your area. But new growth is when those plants seem to have the most increase in mite populations and would be an appropriate time to use a miticide application in the landscape. Some other activities that you can do, many of us prune our roses when they're dormant. And in that pruning process, these plants in this image, we can see a lot of spent blooms, old leaf debris. Removing that debris and throwing it away. Those mites are often hiding over the winter in that debris. So if we can remove it, we're basically putting a lot of those mites in the trash, less opportunity for the problem the next season. Following this with dormant oil is highly recommended. Dormant oils are usually about 3 to 4% oil concentration, and they basically smother those overwintering mites. And we know just from some of our trials that this is really effective at reducing mite populations, especially during the spring. Note that if you wait and your roses are really flushing out, sometimes those dormant oils can cause some phytotoxicity or burn. So the timing is kind of critical. Replanting, that's the next most popular question. Can I replant in the same site? And I would say whenever you can have a fallow period, no plants in that site for a while, that's going to be helpful. But some people do replant immediately. If you're going to do that, dig out that plant. I actually suggest people put a trash bag, or even if it's a big plant, maybe use some like a drop cloth that you put when you're painting, wrap it around the plant, cut it off at the base, and take it right to the trash. Afterwards, rake up debris, throw it away, and then you technically can put a plant right back in that hole. Many people do it. I would encourage you, it might be worth treating that replacement plant and the other roses in the area with a miticide in case we disturbed any of those mites during the removal process. So one issue, sometimes rose rosette develops on the new plants. If it does, you probably have a source of rose rosette in your area. There may be wild roses, such as multiflora rose, or you could have neighbors that have infected plants on their property. So it may come back. I've seen roses being replanted. We're using them here in Oklahoma more as perennials that last a few years rather than really long plantings, and just replacing them as we need to. Some tips for new installations: avoiding mass plantings of roses. I think that's one way this disease really got out of control. Diversifying. This is a sort of interrupted planting of roses with some other plants. And in some of Dr. Wyndham's trials, he showed that these green barriers can help slow the spread of rose rosette. So in the background of that image, those roses have rose rosette, but the ones in the foreground didn't have any symptoms. And so they can remove those two in the background, and likely those two in the foreground don't have any symptoms. So this is an image. I actually got this off of Google Street View. This is a neighborhood where my daughter's best friend lives. And I, over the years have taken my daughter to her house many times, and I've noticed this planting. They have a lot of plant material that's non-roses. And then where the arrow is pointing is 3 or 4 rose bushes in the center. And this landscaper's used a combination of green barriers as well as structure, that sign for the development, to help keep the mites from landing on the roses. And this planting was only a quarter mile from heavily infected plants. And it lasted at least 7 or 8 years before I saw the first symptoms of rose rosette in the neighborhood areas where I live, Stillwater, Oklahoma, that has very heavy rose rosette problem. This is in my neighbor's house. So I'm pointing at their rose bushes with these arrows. he is keeping his roses healthy by keeping a very wide spacing between the plants. In a local area, most of the movement of the mites is simply crawling or jumping from plant to plant. So maintaining this wider spacing is one way to help slow the spread of the disease. The mites, excuse me, in order to get from one plant to the other would basically have to get caught by the wind and carried onto the next plant because they're so well spaced, and they're just as likely to blow off the property. One other thing, anything you can do to help keep roses healthier, um, reducing stress is a way to resist rose rosette as well as other disease problems. I always remind landscapers, I don't recommend using leaf blowers around roses. I know a lot of times we use leaf blowers to clean up grass clippings and other debris, but with roses, you're basically launching those mites in to out to the potential to infect a lot of other plants. So use them in other areas, but I'd avoid using them around roses. We're almost wrapping this up, but another question, are there any resistant cultivars? So we've done some trials in Oklahoma. There's some actually ongoing. Dr. Dave Byrne at Texas A&M is actually a rose breeder, and he's the lead on that Sustainable Roses project that I mentioned. He's coordinating rose trials right now between Texas, Tennessee, and Oklahoma. I don't know if he has other states at this point, but those are the main ones. And they're trialing plants that are already out in the industry as well as crosses that he and his students have made to try to see if some of the wild type roses do tend to have tolerance or resistance to rose rosette, if we can get that into our more cultivars that are more desirable horticultural traits. One of This is one of the publications coming out of some of the work that Dr. Byrne and others have been doing. This is a publication about field resistance where they actually planted out roses in highly infested areas and monitored these plants to see if they developed symptoms and then categorized them whether or not they showed resistance or tolerance to rose rosette. So you could always look up that publication yourself, but I'm going to show you just one of the tables where they actually show a list of roses with low or no symptom development. And so these may be, if you have an area that you work in that has a lot of rose rosette, it might be worth trying some of these cultivars in those locations. There'll be more data coming out of that project over the next few years, and I'm hopeful that we'll see some really resistant cultivars coming on the market soon. So with that, I'm going to go on and I'm going to move on to some fungal diseases. Especially this year, I saw more fungal diseases I'd seen in a lot of time, and it was because we had a very rainy spring. And I know a lot of people had that across the country. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about leaf spots, anthracnose, and canker diseases. So here are some leaf spots. I get a lot of images sent in, can you look at this mulberry and tell me, what's wrong with it? I always encourage people when they're thinking about leaf spots, consider the time of year that you're seeing the leaf spot. If it's in the fall, especially on a deciduous plant like this mulberry, we probably don't need chemical control. But if we're seeing this in the spring on young leaves, chemical control may be necessary. So time of year is important. It's always helpful with fungal diseases to use an integrated pest management approach. So not just using a chemical application, often that's our last resort, but thinking about other things that influence the severity of this disease. First of all, if we have a lot of these leaves laying on the ground, within those spots that you're seeing, there are spores or propagules of the fungus that cause that spot. So just, if it's healthy leaves, I say leave them on the property. We don't have to worry about it. But if these leaves are spotted and may carry fungal propagules, you're better to rake them up and discard them. At a minimum, shred them or mow them to try to get those leaves and those fungal structures to break down. If you have a particular problem plant that had a lot of leaf spot last year, another great tip is in the winter, very early spring, before bud break, adding a layer of mulch under those plants. If there are some of these fungal spores that are laying under that plant, if we cover it in mulch, we've interrupted some of that dispersal. It can't just fly or splash back up. And so that's one great way to use IPM is by adding some mulch and burying some of those spores. In the spring, if you do have a plant that maybe it's had trouble in the past or you've seen it on other plants in the area, you start to see some spots develop, you may want to use chemical control, which is a fungicide application, a foliar application, or an injection. There's lots of different products that are effective for chemical control of leaf spot diseases. So azoxystrobin, chlorothalonil, copper, pick your favorite. In the landscape, we have a lot of choices. I always encourage people, if you're going to make more than one application, you've got a long rainy spring, try to rotate to 2 different classes or types of fungicides. And good coverage is important, especially if you're using a contact or a preventative fungicide. Some of them that are systemic, you don't need quite as good of coverage, but just keep in mind if the plant is growing really quickly, leaves are expanding, you may need another application in a few weeks, especially if you have a rainy spring or cooler temperatures. Some other cultural control, improving air circulation around and through plants. Sometimes I've noticed plants are very dense. I have a lilac that's being troubled by a leaf spot, and I really need to get in there and thin it. So after it blooms next spring, that is happening. Thinning plants, plants do increase in size. You may need to remove some plants if the plant has doubled or tripled in size. And think about the timing and method of irrigation. My children, they like to play in the sprinkler, so we'll put the sprinkler on a tree in the evenings, figure we're watering the tree, but we're creating a really wet environment, humid, damp, all night long. And that is going to be more likely to see an increase in disease. My neighbor who's retired, he waters his trees and shrubs in the morning. And he has a lot less disease just because he has a lesser period of leaf wetness and high humidity. Sometimes using soaker hoses or just applying a hose right at the base or near the base of a plant is better than a sprinkler. If you do, something like these photinias, if these leaf spots get out of control, you may need to replace a plant. And I wouldn't go back in with the same type of plant, or if you do, take some time and look and see if there are newer varieties or cultivars that have resistance. Often, especially if a plant's been out for 10 years, there's newer, better ones on the market. Let's move on to anthracnose. So anthracnose is basically really bad leaf spot where we go beyond the leaf spot and the fungus starts to enter the veins. So on these elm leaves, especially that leaf in the center that's upside down, notice that it's not just a spot. The veins are actually becoming discolored. And eventually this fungus can move into the mid vein, the petiole, and then later the branches. And that's where it's going to survive the winter. And so often with these anthracnose diseases, if you see it one year, you're going to see it the next. This year in my area, sycamore anthracnose was especially bad. when I feel like we're going to see a lot of it next year. And it'll probably start as early as bud break, where we see these young leaves coming out and they're almost immediately blighted or killed. Later on, as the leaves mature, later infections look more like this, where we see the spot. And again, we see that fungus moving down into the mid vein. This image on the upper left, it's moving down. That one half of the leaf is now wilted and brown. It's definitely in that mid vein, maybe that petiole. And eventually it'll make its way into the branch itself. So that bottom image, the center of that branch is kind of cracked and swollen on the top and bottom due to sycamore anthracnose. That fungus is going to survive there over season, and then next spring it's right there ready to shower spores on nearby leaves and buds. So that's why if you see it one year, these anthracnose diseases, a lot of times you see several years in a row. Overall, you can get defoliation, canopy thinning. People will complain about all the leaves on the ground. These are some trees at a park that's near my home. The tree on the left, these are probably clonal trees. And that tree on the left, I don't see much blue sky, but the tree on the right, I can see a lot more of the sky. That canopy is a lot thinner. Why is one tree more susceptible or showing more symptoms? May have to do with environmental stress. There's a lot more activity under that thinner tree because of the playground, and that's probably it. So what can we do about anthracnose? A lot of this is the same as leaf spots, raking up leaves, but looking for those blighted twigs and pruning them out. If you're using a hand pruning tool, it's helpful to clean your pruners, with a disinfectant, Lysol spray, Clorox cleanup, or a bleach solution. If you're at the point where you're cutting with a chainsaw, the heat of that blade is going to be a disinfectant for you. I encourage people, healthy plant material, I don't have a problem with composting it or leaving on site. But if it's diseased, a source of fungal material, you are better to throw that in the trash. Consider if you need to thin out branches to help increase airflow through the canopy. My neighbor has a couple of Chinese elms, and the one in his front yard's in a very windy area. He has two in his backyard where his 6-foot privacy fence really reduces airflow. And he always has a lot of anthracnose on those elm trees in the backyard that we don't see on the front yard, partially just because of airflow. And then basically address causes of environmental stress. If you have other issues going on, a lot of compaction issues, maybe they're parking a car under the tree, see if we can help reduce some of that stress to reduce the pressure of stress. And usually the amount of disease you see is reduced. Fungicide applications for anthracnose can start at bud swell. Often a second application is needed, especially if you're in an area with a cool or rainy spring. And if you've had a tree that's been troubled by it in the past, you're more likely to see it again. Again, many different fungicides are available. If it's a contact product, you got to get good coverage. Something systemic like a myclobutanol, propiconazole, you don't need as good of a coverage, but we're more likely to see resistance. So if you're going to make a second application, you may want to use something in a different fungicide class. For some of the anthracnose diseases, we do have injections that are labeled. The nice thing about the injections is they go right into those trees, and they can last for up to 3 years. 2 years is probably more practical, but up to 3. And so it actually gets it in that tree right to where it needs to be. So you might consider injections over foliar applications. So I want to move on to some branch dieback, and we're actually going to look at cankers and wilts here. I get a lot of pictures submitted, and something like this, what's wrong with my tree? I don't know. I bet there's something going on though. Something is causing those branches to turn color. And the first step is going to be getting a closer look at one of those branches. Um, it's always possible it's progressed into the trunk or the roots, but at least start those branches are dying and they're signaling, look at me more closely. One of the I get samples from all over the country, everywhere from Florida, California, Arkansas, Texas, and regardless of where things are coming from in the country, I find a lot of fungi causing canker and decline that are in this family Botryosphaeriaceae. At one time, they might have been classified as Botrosphaeria species. A lot of taxonomic changes. They're still in the family, but you may see some of these other genera. I call them bot canker since they're in that Botrosphaeriaceae family. So one of our county extension educators brought me these elm branches. This was only about 2 weeks ago. And she was worried it might be Dutch elm disease since, we see some browning and leaf rolling. And as I started looking at these branches, I noticed that there was a lot of wounds. So in these circled areas on the left, it looks to me like maybe the branches were rubbing. There's a lot of damage on one side of the limb. In the image on the right, I have some arrows pointing to breaks. I think these might be from hail damage. I didn't see evidence of cicadas, but it does kind of cause similar injury. But one of the things about these bot canker fungi is they usually infect through wounds. So if you have some kind of weather event, ice storm, hailstorm, wind, you're more likely to find these fungi. Sometimes these can be pruned out. So, getting in there, flipping it out. Chinese pistache on the left, after a hailstorm, these noticed these kind of resinous cankers, which we did get a Botrosphaeria species out of this. If you're going to prune it out, this image on the right, you want to, very often these fungi are associated with visible cankers on the outer part of the branch or visible discoloration throughout the wood. So as you're pruning, you want to try to find that point where the wood inside goes back to the normal yellow-green color if you're trying to cut out the fungus. Cut at least 8 to 12 inches lower on the branch than where you see the discoloration. Now, sometimes I'm lucky enough, I get actual images of the tree. So this elm tree here, Laura, this extension educator, actually sent a picture of the whole tree that she collected the sample from. And I'm not sure exactly where she collected the sample. Overall, this tree looks to be thinning, maybe some hot, dry summer we had. But especially on the right, those branches look really thin. I'm not sure where I would start pruning. And overall, I say always assess that tree at the site because I'm not going to go into why, but maybe there's some other reasons why this particular tree might ought to be removed. There also, a lot of times people sample branches because they're able to reach them. We tend to get smaller caliber. There could actually be larger problems in the main, trunks or roots of this plant. But overall, I'd probably recommend removing this tree rather than trying to prune it out. One thing that's kind of notable is I am starting to see a lot more leaf symptoms associated with fungi in the Botrosphaeriaceae. We've seen this in apple for a while. So you see these apple leaves have one species that causes what we call a frog eye leaf spot of Botrosphaeria causing this. This year I had samples sent in from elms, Chinese pistache, pecan, I think a tulip tree, where we were seeing leaf spots. And when we cultured them, we were covering these bot canker fungi from leaf spots. So I expect I may see more of that in the future. So let's move on to vascular wilt diseases. Um, Dutch elm disease, I don't know where you are in the country. We still have a lot of elms here in Oklahoma, and we saw a lot of Dutch elm disease this year. You peel back the bark. I usually use a vegetable peeler, and you can see that typical streaking just under the bark in the xylem. This picture on the right was taken by my husband about 20 years ago of an elm that's just sort of in the full throes of Dutch elm disease. It's really hard to distinguish a lot of these vascular diseases. This sugar maple has verticillium wilt, similar type of streaking. And then one that you may or may not have heard of, this is a newer disease called vascular streak dieback. Especially dogwoods, redbud, maples. We're starting to see this more and more. And so I want you to be aware of it. The symptoms may start as yellowing or even scorching of the leaves. Sometimes we see the wilt, but this vascular streak dieback has been found for maybe the past 4 or 5 years. And I've seen it mostly in nurseries, but now it's making its way out into the landscape. Plant pathologists are still working on confirming the actual cause of this. It is associated with a, Ceratobasidium species. And so they're still working on verifying that this is the exact cause. A lot of times we find this disease with other problems. So there may sort of be a synergistic effect. If you have one problem, you get a lot of problems. So we saw the yellowing and leaf scorch and wilting on the previous slide. Some of that vascular discoloration. Often you'll find on young plants this tip dieback. Sometimes this can be confused with freeze damage. So actually cutting into this wood, looking for that vascular discoloration is one way you might rule out that it's not freeze damage. Notice how big that leaf is in the background. Mature redbud leaves are what, 3 inches maybe, and sometimes they describe this mouse ear symptom. These little leaves emerge at the base of where these branches have died back, and they're very tiny and usually yellow or red in color. The host range of vascular streak dieback just continues to grow. You can, Google this for yourself if you need to refer back to what these hosts are. Eastern redbud definitely seems to be the most severely affected, but maples, lilacs, dogwoods are also affected. And this host range is likely just to continue to grow as it is now moving out of nurseries and into landscapes. At this point, there's no chemical treatments that are specific for vascular streak dieback. There's been some fungicide trial work done mostly in Tennessee showing that preventative applications of fungicides can help manage disease symptoms in nurseries. And they're not so much managing the vascular streak dieback pathogen, that Ceratobasidium species. It seems to be helping to manage other disease problems. So maybe these plants are less stressed or wounded, and they have less of the vascular streak dieback. Right now, I'm not seeing data that's showing fungicides are going to be practical for landscape plantings, but hopefully as we learn more about this disease, maybe we will have fungicides in our future in the landscape. So some management, proper irrigation, planting depth. A lot of times plants seem to be planted too deeply. They seem predisposed to problems, including this one. If you are a landscaper and you order in a lot of plants in either the fall or spring and hold them as you get them planted out, try to keep your stock from different vendors separated and well labeled. You may see symptoms develop over time. And if you know where it all came from, it's going to be easier to scout and remove symptomatic stock. Maintain proper fertility as the plants get stressed. They're more susceptible to this problem. One of the tips that they've found is avoiding unnecessary pruning. is helpful because you're creating a lot of wound sites where the ceratobacillium pathogen could infect. As you are thinning, focus on trying to open up airflow to those plants and light penetration. So as the plant grows, it's not holding moisture and it's going to be less prone to infection. Best time for pruning, especially the more susceptible host, is going to be late winter to early spring. And then there's some data suggesting this has an aerial spore stage, how it's being spread around, and it might sporulate on debris that you leave under these pruned plants. So picking that up and throwing it in the trash is being suggested. I would say if you have some plants that are wilting, showing decline, look for that vascular discoloration. If you're finding it, especially if it's a newly planted tree or shrub, you might have it checked out for a vascular streak dieback. Since we are trying to learn the host range, it may not be plants on the list that I sent you, but it is something we're trying to learn more about and where it's at in communities across the nation. Older trees and shrubs, 5, 6 years or older, less likely to be vascular streak dieback. It could be verticillium wilt or something else, but you still might have that checked out by a diagnostic lab. The main reason why, probably the person's going to want a new tree. And if you know what the host range is for that pathogen, you can plant something resistant. Some of these vascular wilt fungi make really long-lived spores. And so replanting in that same site is risky if you're replanting with something susceptible. So at this point, I just want to talk as we finish up here about prevention of plant diseases. I think as landscapers, you have a lot of opportunity to intervene and see where potential problems might be developing and stop them. This is a topiary on the OSU campus. We love our orange. And this buffalo is a topiary that they wanted to, it was growing in the under shade, and they wanted to move it out as students came back for the semester in August when temperatures were 100 degrees. It was bright and sunny. And so they probably would have observed a lot of burn and scorch if they just put it right out. So they actually put up this shade to help protect this guy. And so he looks pretty good. That shade was protecting him until he's now become established at the site and they don't need to use that tent anymore. So I took some pictures as I walked around our campus. A lot of landscapes are going to look pretty similar to what I saw, but I just wanted to point out some things where I recognize these are some problems that probably could have been prevented. Maybe there's still some intervention that could be done. So the building that I work in is shown in the background there. And I know that when this building was constructed, they brought in a lot of sand. And this is where that sand was piled. Actually, they added greenhouses on, and that's where they had the sand. And afterwards, they removed some of the sand, but this particular patch of grass has at least 8 inches of sand. And every summer, it's the first area that dries out. Somebody probably needs to go in if they get tired of this turning brown and in the heat of summer and putting in some other type of soil so that or upping the amount of irrigation, because this area always dries out first. Drainage issues, a lot of times, visiting a property after rain is helpful to help address drainage issues. This site in the lawn just seems to hold water. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but certainly this kind of thing could be addressed. Usually in the spring, this area is very thin, muddy, sometimes stinky. And so this is a kind of thing that could be corrected. Another area where there's been some drainage issues, this is a real low spot on the campus, and they actually moved in and put in a French drain, ran it under that sidewalk. And so they added this gravel because prior to that, everything they planted in that spot would just have wet feet and die. And so they've kind of used this sort of rocky area to help direct the water away from those plants. And now plants in that area are starting to thrive. Compaction is something you see a lot. You know, if you go to a property and the kids have a swing set in a certain area, you may notice this kind of compaction issue where they run across the grass. You know, those kind of things, I say you could, you know, possibly install some pavers or stepping stones just to help to reduce some of that issue. But that's why this grass doesn't look quite as good, as it's just become really compacted from our students cutting across this jagged corner. pH, as you're about to plant things out, I always encourage soil testing so that you know what kind of soil you're dealing with, the pH level, and the nutrition that's there. These sweet spires just look awful and they're really stunted. They're not doing well. But this area has pHs 7.5 or above. And it's just not not a good choice. You know, there's lots of plants that are more adapted to alkaline pH. Simple plant choice could improve this. So maintaining trees, you know, when trees are young, there's a lot of opportunities to give them their best life. So I got these images of this tree. We see the leaves are scorched, they're not doing well. And when I get images, I want to see that whole tree. And so they show me the bottom of the plant. This plant's dealing with a lot of competition for water and nutrients, and that's likely why those leaves are scorching. I also want to point out, we're always worried about damage from mowers and string trimmers. And they said, oh, we just held that up for the picture. And so they actually have this little guard around the tree. And so at least that's preventing damage from lawn equipment, but this tree is not going to perform as well as if it had a plant-free area at the base. So research studies have shown 3 to 6 feet plant-free area will help plants grow and establish in sites much more quickly. Plants with grass growing right up to their base may be permanently stunted. Here's that damage from lawn equipment. You know, I don't know if it's going to recover or not. My crystal ball isn't working well enough to tell me, but certainly correcting this so that you can avoid damage in the future. Here's one where this tree, they mulched it to try to reduce additional damage. And we can see some callus tissue developing around the base of that tree. So for maintaining trees, you know, mulching, providing irrigation during periods of drought and heat stress, maintaining nutrition as based on a soil test, all great ways to help improve tree health in the long run. Mulching and staking properly. You know, I don't know if this is a mulch volcano, looks a little questionable to me. Some other areas where they had recently installed plants, I noticed our grounds services, they were kind of pulling back the mulch from around the tree. They told me that these plants are planted on a little bit of a hill to make sure water is draining away from them. And so the mulch may not be as deep as what I think it is. Staking. You know, this is properly staked. I personally think we ought to remove stakes, especially in Oklahoma, windy areas after a month or so. Those trees really need to get used to the wind. It helps develop a better root system. This is not proper staking. This is a stake that came with the tree, really just to help prevent damage during shipping. It's just propped up against the tree. That's not proper staking. Herbicide injury, you know, recognizing it and avoiding it. Plants with herbicide injury, often they recover, sometimes they don't. It's going to be a wait and see thing, but identifying the source, you may help prevent it from happening again in the future. Winter protection. So we're getting into fall, winter. Some of us, where I start to see some diseases more commonly in the landscape, is when we're fertilizing late in the year. Usually mid-August or September is when we stop. You're more likely to see things like this spring dead spot in this grass. Or in that picture on the right, this was a fertilized rose very late in the season. It's just not going to be as tolerant of preparation of frost and freeze if we have this succulent growth late in the season. Some other things, anytime you see dead branches, I would go ahead and prune them out, especially if you suspect they might be diseased. But winter is a great opportunity to prune plants and improve structure and identify problems. Um, Here in Oklahoma, we have southern magnolias, and a lot of times we get this winter browning that occurs. It tends to be both caused by a combination of poor watering in the fall as those plants prepare for dormancy, not watering them at all during the winter. They are a broadleaf evergreen, losing lots of water through wind, desiccation through those leaves. So here, if we have a dry winter, I suggest people water those broadleaf evergreens about once a month. It's a great way to prevent a problem. Otherwise, they're complaining about how brown their tree is in the spring. Sometimes cold temperatures get really cold. We can still get some browning, but we can at least stop the desiccation problem with irrigation if we have a dry winter. Tree wraps. So we've all seen damage to tree trunks. If it's on the south or west facing side, it's probably from sun scald or southwest injury. Over time, you can have these secondary things. Sometimes frost or freeze cracks that develop during the winter. Many of these can be prevented just by wrapping the trunks of younger trees during the winter. In the winter, it's better to use a cloth wrap. In the summer, you might be able to get away with one of these plastic wraps, which also just help protect and shade that trunk. Sun scald was once thought just to happen in the winter, but now we think it also can happen in the summer. So some other things that happen in the winter, animals get a little hungry. You may notice more damage from sapsuckers, all those holes in the tree. Or on our campus here, we see a lot of damage from squirrels and rabbits peeling the bark off of trees. So that's why they have that chicken wire around the trunk. For the birds, sometimes these scaring things, owls, this irritate can be helpful. But sometimes they just have a favorite tree and you may need to put a fence around it, physical exclusion with that chicken wire. So we covered all these common diseases in the landscape. I just want to mention, I'm part of the National Plant Diagnostic Network. We're here to support landscapers. If you have tree problems, whether it's plant diseases or arthropods, you might consider contacting a diagnostic lab near you, getting to know them. They want to know what's going on out in the landscape, what's affecting problems, so they can target research and management to what's happening in your community. So feel free to reach out. And with that, I'm going to say, feel free to contact me with any questions. If you happen to call our lab, you might get some others from my team there, other diagnosticians and lab techs that we have. But my email address is there. I generally answer the sick plants email, and Nicole is there. With the glasses in the center black shirt, she will be answering that got bugs question, and we're happy to help you look at images and try to address problems. With that, I appreciate your time, and hopefully you've learned a little bit about some of the problems in the landscape today.